The English word charity comes from the Latin word caritas, and we can translate caritas as kindness. So living with a disposition of caritas towards other people is living with a disposition of kindness towards other people, a willingness to give them a break, a willingness to cut them some slack, a willingness to exercise some grace. It doesn't mean that anything goes, right? But in the normal give and take of life, we're willing to give another person the benefit of the doubt, to exercise some grace, to cut other people some slack. And I think this is linked to the principle of the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule says that we should treat other people as we want to be treated. Now that's a principle that's easy to understand. Treat other people as we want to be treated. It's very hard to put into practice day by day. All right, so we don't want to be gossiped about. We don't want people to judge us with unnecessary harshness, right? But it's difficult for us sometimes to resist the temptation to judge other people with unnecessary harshness. It's difficult for us to resist the temptation to gossip. And so the Golden Rule is easily understood but difficult to practice. But of course, we want to practice it, continuously practice it, exercising the Golden Rule, treating other people as we would want them to treat us. What we want to do is apply this to thinking about history. And if our conception of history is just knowing names, dates, and events, then that doesn't involve a lot of thought. What we're talking about here is actually thinking about history, looking at something people said, something people did, and then coming to conclusions about it, making judgments about it. And so we want to exercise grace not only to people in our world, the world we live in our own lives, but here the idea is exercising grace towards people who actually are powerless because they're dead. They can't defend themselves. They can't speak up for themselves. It may be that we have their letters, it may be that we have their diaries, we have their books, but they can't come to their own defense in any active way. And so we have the stuff of their lives in front of us, and that's a lot of power. That's a lot of power to come to historical judgments about what people in the past did. Now, if we think about it, if people in the future had access to everything that we wrote, everything that we produced, everything that we posted online, then we would want them, I think, to cut us a little slack, to exercise a little grace, to try to understand where we were coming from. We would not want them to come to casually critical judgments about us. And so that's what we're working with here, the idea of thinking about history and applying this idea of caritas, of kindness, when we're making judgments about history. And some of the things we want to keep in mind is context, what was going on in that day and time. History is often a foreign country, right? The past is a foreign country. Different environments, different languages, different contexts, different cultures, right? And so it's important to try to understand things in context. Also the motivation of the people involved, and then the characters of the people involved. Now, sometimes there are, I think, easy cases, all right? Up top we have a fellow named Robert Mugabe who destroyed the country of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, not so long ago, was a country that was the breadbasket of Africa. It was a agriculturally productive country. Robert Mugabe destroyed Zimbabwe, right? And so here I think we can come to a pretty easy judgment. And remember, exercising caritas in the past, cutting people slack, doesn't mean anything goes. And Robert Mugabe, if we ask questions about character, then he was just simply a bad man. Does that mean that he didn't in his daily life do nice things for certain people? No, I'm sure if we look at particular things in his life, we could say, well, that was nice and that was nice. But on the whole, he was not a good man. He destroyed his country. And so I think it's a pretty easy judgment to come to, okay? So when we're talking about applying caritas in our lives, trying to promote a disposition of kindness towards others in our own lives and also in thinking of the past, that doesn't mean that we don't come to judgments. And sometimes judgments can be pretty abrupt. Robert Mugabe was a bad man who destroyed his country. I think that's a pretty fair judgment. We could say the same thing of Hitler. who destroyed much of Europe, including his own country, right? And here's a person, again, we look at the character of this person, a rage-filled, hate-filled, destructive person. And so, I mean, again, maybe we could look at certain things and say, well, in this instance, Adolf Hitler was, did something nice for somebody, right? But obviously, the general story in his case is that he's one of the great mass murderers of history. And so that's a pretty clear judgment that we can come to. Hugo Chavez destroyed the nation of Venezuela. Venezuela could be a prosperous country. It's got so much oil, Venezuela does. Venezuela could be a wealthy, prosperous country. But it's not. It's the opposite of that. And that is primarily the responsibility of Hugo Chavez. Again, I'm sure, we could say, well, this particular thing that Hugo Chavez did, that was kind of nice. Okay, whatever. But the general story is that he was a bad person. Here we're focusing on characters. And these three people, I think we can describe them justly as bad people who destroyed their country. So that's pretty straightforward. That's pretty straightforward. I don't think that that's very controversial. We can go to the other side. Eric Liddell, who was a great athlete, a great Olympic athlete, and who found himself as a missionary in China during the Second World War. He found himself in a Japanese prison camp. And the stories of how he conducted himself in that Japanese prison camp, very inspiring, right? Very inspiring. Now, if we look at the details of Liddell's life, can we find something to criticize? I'm sure, right? But I think everyone would agree that it's pretty easy to come to judgment about Eric Liddell, right? He was a good man. He was a good person. He was an inspiring person. Maria Corina Machado, Venezuelan, standing up for free speech, standing up for the basic rights of the people in opposition to Hugo Chavez. Is she a normal human being with flaws? I'm sure of it, right? But when we look at what she tried to do against the works of the dictator Hugo Chavez, then I think most people would agree, impressive, right? Paul Rusesabagina in the country of Rwanda, who saved hundreds of people's lives as a disaster was unfolding in that country. Again, he's a normal human being, therefore flawed, therefore we could find things in his life that we could criticize. But when it comes to historical judgment about his role in Rwanda in the early 1990s, then I think there's general agreement, right, that here's a person who was impressive. So sometimes when it comes to historical questions, it's pretty easy. Hitler, that's easy. Eric Liddell, that's easy, okay? And, sometimes history offers us pretty clear examples. But other times, things get more complicated, and so that's what we want to look at now. So let's look at Aristotle. So I've mentioned in previous discussions that Aristotle has had a great influence on me. He's one of our great ethical teachers. He's a foundational ethical teacher, a foundational teacher of ethics. If you have a class in college, an ethics class in college, that doesn't spend a fair amount of time on Aristotle, then I'm going to be suspicious of the quality of that class, right? Because he's foundational when it comes to ethics. And I can speak from personal experience that Aristotle has been quite useful to me, right, in my personal life as I have read and reflected on some of the things that he said. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that Aristotle had a fairly casual attitude about slavery. So he refers to people whose condition is such that their function is the use of their bodies. So there are some people who are not intellectually inclined. And for Aristotle, the highest function of a person was the use of the intellect, right? There are some people who just aren't into that. Maybe if they take an IQ test, they're not going to score very high. They're never going to be good at math. They're never going to be good at chemistry. They're never going to, have a role in a play that involves memorizing lines, right? So these are folks who perhaps would not do very well on an IQ test, and so they do manual labor, right? And so they work and they use their bodies, they don't use their mind, right? Nothing better can be expected of them. Now notice Aristotle's bias. Aristotle's bias is that, if a person gets through life working with his or her hands, as a bricklayer or something like that, then the implication seems to be then that's inferior to a person whose work primarily involves using the mind, right? Now that's Aristotle's bias, okay? And that's not our bias. So this is one of the things we notice about Aristotle, that he has a bias, and that the thing that is most godlike among people, Aristotle thinks, is the use of the mind. And so therefore those who use the mind the most and those who use their minds the best are functioning at the highest level. And those who really, don't use the mind in any sophisticated way, then they're operating at a lower level. And these are the folks, Aristotle says, who are slaves by nature. It is better for them to be ruled. So I think he's talking about people who not only, perhaps wouldn't do real well on an IQ test, and whatever work they do in the world involves primarily manual labor, that is, the use of the hands, right? Building and, doing that sort of work. But he also seems to be implying these are folks who aren't necessarily self-disciplined, they're not well self-controlled, and so they need to be ruled. Aristotle says by nature some are free, others slaves. And so Aristotle's view is that the natural order of things is slavery. That slavery is part of the natural order of things. Now, I as I was thinking about this, my first thought was, well, that was the view that everyone had in Aristotle's day. It's, that was pretty much the only view. And so it's hard to criticize someone if there aren't alternative views out there. But then I saw, as I was reviewing some passages in Aristotle's book about politics, I saw this quote from Aristotle. Aristotle says that some say that it is contrary to nature to rule as master over slave. What this says is that in Aristotle's own day, there were people who took a view different from Aristotle's. There were, as Aristotle says, well, slavery is just part of the way, the natural order of things. Aristotle is indicating that there were people in his world who disagreed, all right? And these people say, because the distinction between slave and free is one of convention only. In other words, there were folks in Aristotle's day who, if you ask them why does slavery exist today, they won't say, well, it's because it's, the way it's the stuff of nature, right? They say slavery exists today because it's existed in the past, right? It's the stuff of convention, it's the stuff of tradition. Right? But these folks say that this is a form of rule that's based on force, and therefore it's not just. Now, it was interesting because I had highlighted this passage in Aristotle's Politics twice. So I had apparently read it, at least a couple times, but I had forgotten about it. It had slipped out of my mind. And so when I came into this discussion, before I reviewed these pages, my assumption was that Aristotle's view that slavery is just part of the natural order of things, that there wasn't an alternative view in his world. But Aristotle himself tells us that there was, right? That there are some people who disagreed with Aristotle and said, no, this idea of one person owning another human being, right? And then maintaining that relationship through force, there's something basically unjust about that, which of course is the view that I think we would take. And so all of a sudden becomes more complicated because on the one hand, you've got Aristotle, the great teacher of ethics, and then at the same time, you've got this great teacher of ethics who is hearing other people say that slavery is basically unjust, that slavery is based on power, that slavery is not part of the natural order, it's just something that's developed in human tradition, but it doesn't have to continue. He heard all of that, and he rejected that. And he maintained what looks to us like a fairly casual attitude about slavery. So that's complicated. I mean, how do you put these things together? How do you have the great teacher of ethics, the foundational teacher of ethics, also taking what looks like a fairly casual attitude towards slavery? So that's complicated. Hitler, that's easy. Robert Mugabe, easy. Hugo Chavez, easy. Eric Liddell, easy. Paul Rusesabagina, easy. But this is more complicated. This is tougher, right? This is a tougher thing. And it's not hard to argue with. Aristotle says, well, some people by nature are slaves, but slaves will have children, and then those children, presumably some of them anyway, are slaves by virtue of being born to slaves. And if someone is born a slave, then there's a good chance they're never going to be able to exercise whatever gifts they might have, right? And then, therefore, as a result, down the road, people say, oh, well, that person is by nature a slave because he or she doesn't have, any apparent gifts. But the reason that person doesn't have any apparent gifts is that the person was never able to exercise those apparent gifts because the person was held in slavery, right? We have an example, Epictetus. We've mentioned him before, a very influential Stoic philosopher. You can read his works today. I have. You can benefit from them. He was born into slavery. And he was a slave from birth to the age of 18. Now it turns out that Epictetus had a master who allowed him to study philosophy. His master saw that Epictetus had some gifts, right? And so therefore Epictetus was able to study philosophy and eventually gain his freedom and become a prominent teacher, right? But what if Epictetus had had a different master who did not allow him to study? What if he grew up in a different context where there were no teachers available? Then it's possible that Epictetus would have lived his whole life without whatever gifts he had to offer the world ever coming to light. So Aristotle says by nature, some people are slaves, some people are free, right? But if a person is born into slavery and treated as a slave through childhood and on the way up, how are we going to know? Another example is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington wrote his autobiography, Up from Slavery. It's a great book, and I've read it several times, right? But Booker T. Washington was a child when the Civil War ended, when the American Civil War ended in 1865, and slavery was abolished. And so when he's a child, slavery no longer exists. Which means now that Booker T. Washington is going to have opportunities. Now, he works extremely hard, right? But he takes advantage of the opportunities that come, and he eventually establishes his own educational organization called the Tuskegee Institute. Now it's Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington goes on to be a person of great influence. But had Booker T. Washington been born 20 years earlier, we almost certainly would not have heard of him because he would have remained a slave into his 20s, and he never would have had the opportunity to develop himself as a young person, right? So, not only then does Aristotle take a view on slavery that seems kind of casual to us, but it's also a view that I think is fairly easy to argue with, right? It's fairly easy to critique. So what do we do with this? So again, in the case of, Hugo Chavez, Hitler, Mugabe, Little, those cases I think are pretty straightforward, pretty easy to come to judgments. Aristotle, this is tougher. He's a great moral, or a great ethicist, right? A foundational ethical teacher. Then he takes a pretty casual view of slavery. So how do we work with this, right? And so this is a more difficult thing. So we consider context. Well, Aristotle himself tells us that there were people in his own day who had views different from his. He recounts what their views were, and those views happen to be our views, right? That there's something fundamentally unjust about the idea of one human being owning another human being. So that is part of the context. Having said that, I do think that the view Aristotle expresses is the majority view, right? And it's a good example, by the way, of how most people can believe something that, at least certainly today, we're going to look back and say it was wrong, right? So just because most people believe something isn't itself good evidence that that idea is right, okay? So I think that's an important lesson. Having said that, though, exercise a little grace here. Aristotle acknowledged there were people who had views different from his, but I think it is clear that his views expressed the majority views. And as we move through life, of course, it is easier in life to adopt the views of the majority around us. So we make that part of the discussion. And then there's motivation. Is there a reason to believe that, Aristotle woke up, in the morning and said, how can I be a terrible person today? How can I destroy today? How can I ruin other people's lives today? Well, we may say that by taking what looks like a pretty casual view about slavery, that's what happened, right? But I don't think there are grounds for saying that was his motivation. And then we ask the question about character. What kind of person did Aristotle seem to be? Unlike, Mugabe, Hugo Chavez, Hitler, he doesn't seem to be a kind of moral monster, right? He seems to be a person who wants to do right. He seems to be a person who wants to figure out the world. He seems to be a person who wants to help other people to think. And so it looks like in this situation, we're looking at a person who, on the one hand, made really great contributions to the world. Aristotle is one of our foundational thinkers on a number of things, and for me, especially ethics, right? So a person of tremendous influence who did a lot of good for the world, but who also apparently, had a pretty significant blind spot when it comes to slavery, and also we haven't discussed it, but when it comes to his thinking about women, assuming that women really don't have much to offer in public life, which I think, we know now is, clearly not true, right? So, I wish that we could open Aristotle's books and see a person who saw things the way the other people in his own world saw it. Aristotle's writing his book of ethics, and he has that chapter in there on the basic injustice of slavery. I mean, how great that would be to have that, but we don't have that. So we have to look at this and say, well, it's a tough case, right? It's a tough case. Aristotle made great contributions. We wish he had seen this, but he didn't see it. We wish he had. But that doesn't take away from the great contribution. So you see, this is tougher, right? So some calls are easier, some calls are tougher. Let's look at a different example, Marcus Aurelius. We've said a few things about Marcus Aurelius in different discussions. Marcus Aurelius, kind of this person who, maybe more than anyone else in history, sort of meets that ideal of Plato. Plato says the ideal leader is the philosopher king, right? And Marcus Aurelius is that Roman emperor who was also a philosopher, a Stoic philosopher, and he wrote his Meditations, right? And I've read his Meditations many times over the years. It's good stuff. It's useful stuff. But one of the things that's interesting is that Marcus Aurelius, his reign is also associated with one of the great persecutions of the Christians. So how do we put these things together? Well, there was a biography written in the ancient world about Marcus Aurelius. It's included in this book here, The Lives of the Later Caesars. And here's the very first sentence. Marcus Aurelius was a man who devoted himself to philosophy throughout his life, and he excels all the principes, that is, all the leaders, in purity of character. So here's a person devoted to philosophy, and here's a person who pursues purity of character. And you read his Meditations, and that's exactly the kind of person you feel you are in conversation with. As Marcus Aurelius is writing and you're thinking about what he's writing, you feel like you're in the presence of somebody who is pursuing purity of character, right? And then, though, we realize that Christians are persecuted at different times in the Roman Empire, at different levels of intensity, and some of the most intense persecution comes during the time of Marcus Aurelius. Now, since he was a person of such high character, this has been a little bit difficult for historians. Historians have, some historians have said, well, Marcus Aurelius maybe didn't know about the persecution that was going on, right? Others, have said, well, Marcus Aurelius must have known, but kind of, had a hands-off approach. There's some debate among historians about it, and the reason there's debate is because it's kind of hard to put these things together. That you've got this person who's a philosopher, the person who writes the Meditations, the person who's pursuing purity and character, and then during his reign you have one of the most difficult persecutions of the Christians. How do you put these things together? Here's another case where it's a complicated historical situation. One of the sharpest episodes of persecution during Marcus Aurelius' reign comes in the year 177 at Lyon in France, Lugdunum, I think called in Latin there, in France. And here's what it says. Here's a letter written about the persecution there. We cannot accurately tell or describe in detail the magnitude of the distress in this region. Mockings, beatings, draggings, robberies, stonings, imprisonments, everything that an infuriated mob delights to inflict on those whom they consider bitter enemies. The Christians are considered enemies. One of these Christians was named Blandina, and she's tortured, right? But she was filled with such power that those who tortured her one after another in every way from morning till evening were wearied and tired. Now, some of these stories are overblown, right? So the idea is Blandina is being tortured, and the torturers are getting exhausted, as she, just refuses to worship the image of the Caesar or do whatever they want her to do to indicate that she's given up Christianity. Her torturers were astonished that she remained alive, right? But she's part of this persecution and she'll lose her life. Sanctus also nobly endured all the excessive and superhuman tortures, right? So we have not only the execution of Christians, but the torture, the exquisite torture of Christians, right? Now, if this happens during the reign of Nero, if this happens during the reign of Diocletian, these emperors that, kind of have bad reputations, that's not so surprising. This happens during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. So how do you put that together? That's a little complicated. Now, someone might say, well, that's in France, so, that's a long way from Rome at that time, so maybe Marcus Aurelius doesn't really know what's going on. But here's an example from Rome itself, where basically the mayor of Rome, Rusticus, is talking with Justin, this Christian leader, who's called Justin Martyr because he's executed. And the prefect Rusticus says, and the mayor basically of Rome says, if you do not do as you are commanded, you will be tortured without mercy. And Justin said, we hope to suffer torment for the sake of our Lord Jesus Christ and so be saved, right? And he and others end up being executed. It's really hard to believe Marcus Aurelius doesn't know about this. Of course, Marcus Aurelius is, fighting wars and dealing with all kinds of problems, but it's hard to believe that Marcus Aurelius doesn't know about the persecution of the Christians. So this is one of those complicated moments in history, right? Now, again, it's important to understand context. And as we've just said, and as we've discussed, in previous conversations, that Marcus Aurelius is dealing with a lot of problems. Wars on the borders, plague, right? And so great was the fear of the Marcomannic War, that is this war against the Germanic Marcomanni, right, in the northern part of the empire. So great was the plague that Antoninus, that is Marcus Aurelius, summoned priests from all sides, performed rituals, and purified Rome in every way. We've talked about this many times before, right? The idea that these problems are coming to us because the gods are upset, the gods are agitated, we need to appease the gods, and so we're going to sacrifice to the gods. And of course, this is what leads to the persecution of the Christians, because the Christians refuse to acknowledge the gods, including the God of the emperor himself. The Christians say, we'll pray for the emperor, but we won't pray to the emperor, right? We don't acknowledge these gods. We acknowledge one God, right? The God of Isaac, Abraham, etc. Okay? So that's the God we acknowledge. We don't acknowledge the emperor as a god. We don't acknowledge the Roman gods. From the Roman point of view, the Christians are seen, therefore, as a danger to the empire. And so, exercising caritas, trying to understand, what's going on? How can you have this person who on the one hand seems like such a great person? We'd love to have this guy as president. We'd love to have this guy as mayor. We'd love to have this guy as governor, right? That person also, during his reign, you've got one of the more intense moments of persecution. Well, we've talked about context, and then there's motivation. I mean, what motivated Marcus Aurelius to the extent that he was aware of the persecutions? It's hard for me to believe that he wasn't aware of them. And there's no evidence at all that I'm aware of, that he said the persecution should stop. So at the very least, there seems to be implicit consent that the persecution of the Christians is okay with him. But what's his motivation? Does Marcus Aurelius wake up in the morning and say, gosh, there's nothing more I want to do today than, torture people? No, his motivation is to save the empire. Right? His motivation is to save the empire. And his assumption is that the way we save the empire is to put the gods at ease. We put the gods at ease by doing the rituals. And we need as many people doing the rituals as possible. And if these Christians are resisting, then that makes them the enemies of the empire. And just as I'm fighting the Germans, who are the enemies of the empire, these Christians within the empire are enemies of the empire. That's the motivation. I don't think Marcus Aurelius gets up in the morning and says, what can I destroy today? I think Marcus Aurelius says, how can I preserve Rome today? And he acts on that. That's the motivation. And his character, we've talked about that, right? We've talked about that. So this is a challenging thing. And one of the, I think one of the lessons we can learn from this is that it's possible to believe wholeheartedly that one is doing the right thing and still be mistaken. I think Marcus Aurelius sincerely believed that it was very important for the well-being of Rome to appease the gods, to do the rituals, and to go after those in the empire who were angering the gods because they would not do the rituals, that is, the Christians. I think that Marcus Aurelius wholeheartedly believed this, right? And he wholeheartedly believed that the Christians were the enemy of the state, right? And he was wrong. Because, if we could talk to Marcus Aurelius today, we would say, well, guess what? These Christians prayed for you. They helped the poor. They adopted orphans, right? These Christians were actually an asset to the empire. They did good works throughout the empire. They were helpful to the empire, right? But it's impossible for Marcus Aurelius to see that because he's a Roman of his day. And, obviously, there are other Romans who are converting to Christianity who take a different view. Marcus Aurelius wasn't one of them. So I think Marcus Aurelius was sincere, but he was sincerely wrong. And there's an important lesson in that. The photo I have down below is of Charles Lindbergh, a famous aviator, the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. And during the early Second World War, before the United States got in, Charles Lindbergh, made arguments that seemed to indicate that he did not see Nazi Germany as much of a threat, right? And he was wrong. He was sincere, and he took a lot of criticism and had, brought a lot of trouble to himself by making his argument that the United States should stay out of the Second World War, right? And part of that argument was that he seemed not to think of Nazi Germany as a great threat, right, to the world. Well, Charles Lindbergh was wrong, right? He was sincere, but he was wrong. Marcus Aurelius, I think, was sincere about, everything we've talked about and what leads to the persecution of the Christians, but he was wrong. And the same thing's possible for us, and so that leads to this other important thing that we can learn here, the importance of humility. That, of course, in life we want to have principles, we want to have ideals, we want to pursue our principles, we want to pursue our ideals, but always maintain a certain disposition of humility. Because, as we've said in previous discussions, as Paul says, in this world we see through a glass darkly, right? We can't see everything, we can't know everything. Our vision is inevitably limited. Perhaps there's some important bit of information out there we don't have right now, right? And so we act in life, we act on our principles, we do what we think is right, but always recognizing that it may turn out that in some way we're wrong. It may turn out, as was the case with Marcus Aurelius, that he was wrong. It may turn out, as was the case with Charles Lindbergh, that we were wrong. And so that's an important lesson as well. So there are easy cases when we look at historical judgment, making judgments in history. There are some easy cases. Hitler, easy, right? There are other cases that I think are more challenging. Aristotle, that's more challenging. We wish Marcus Aurelius that his reign was not associated with the persecution of the Christians, but it was. And so, we've got to live with this tension. Was Marcus Aurelius, in the context of his own day, a good person? Yeah. Did he write stuff that is still, I think, really useful? Yeah. Was his reign also associated not just with the persecution of the Christians, but with, the torture to death of many Christians? Yeah. Both of those things, and I don't really know how to resolve them, right? We just kind of have to live with that tension. But we want to cut some people slack where it's possible, and so I feel inclined to cut Aristotle some slack. I feel inclined to cut Marcus Aurelius some slack, exercising the golden rule, understanding that in the future people will look back on us and probably wonder what we were thinking about certain things, exercising a little humility, understanding that we see more now than Marcus Aurelius could see. 200 years from now, people will see more than we see. And so we want to conduct ourselves in this world with a degree of humility.